All right, so for this question number two, there's two ways to get this right. Number one, you could just automatically know what the word dexterity means, but if you're here, it's probably because you got the question wrong, and you're going to need to know how to use context clues to actually solve for the meaning of the word dexterity. So that's the way that we're going to go about this in our review of the question is how do we use context clues to determine the meaning of the word dexterity? Because if you knew it, you obviously wouldn't be here and you wouldn't need to use context clues. So we're being asked in this question, which two actions demonstrate Michael O'Neill's dexterity? Here we go with Michael again, the vanishing prince, right? And what we know about Michael so far should be that he's good at getting away. He's good at vanishing. He's really, really tricky. He's sneaky. He has all of these tricks up his sleeves for how to avoid the police who are always chasing after him. And the story goes on to say some of the ways that he does that, hiding as a scarecrow, camouflaging himself in a hotel, and it goes on and on. In this particular sentence, it says his most famous feats of escape, however, were due to dexterity and not to violence. So that, however, is a contrast to the previous sentence that tells you that he actually sometimes used violence to get away. So he would break people's neck and he would say, you're lucky if you managed to get away from one of his escapes, come away from one of his escapes unscathed, unhurt, because sometimes he would use violence. The however here is letting you know that where he really made a name for himself, his most famous escapes are the ones where he doesn't use violence. And it says they're not to violence. They were because of his dexterity and not because of his violence. So we know that dexterity, even if we don't know the dictionary definition of the word, we know it has something to do with maybe getting away, maybe not using violence. But if you're not using violence to get away, how are you going to get away? So here's where you need to be using your reasoning and kind of just common sense to figure out then how is Michael getting away? And if it's due to dexterity and not to violence, maybe it's due to skill, maybe it's due to cunning, his mind, his strategy. This is the kind of thinking you should be doing as you're trying to figure out the meaning of a word that you don't know. So with that in the back of our minds, this idea that maybe it's not violence, if it's not violence, then it's due to skill. That's how he's escaping. That's why he's made a name for himself as the vanishing prince. We should be looking for actions in the answer options that show skill, right? Um, which two actions, this question is asking, show or demonstrate his dexterity? And we're just going to take a guess at this point that show his skill rather than his violence. All right, let's consider the answer options. A, he leads the police to a farm. Does that show his skill? Does that show his dexterity? Doesn't sound like the strongest option. So we don't have to decide yet, but let's move on to the next few options and keep that in the back of our minds. He hides from the police in a well. A well is an underground, hollowed out space where people would drop buckets to pull up water. And so he's crawling down into this underground space and hiding from the police. Does that show skill? I would say so. Would you? So we want to keep that as an option, maybe. B is an option, a good option. C, he disguises himself as a scarecrow. Disguising himself as a scarecrow. Well, that's what we see in this story as one of the examples of his most famous escapes from the police. And that takes a certain level of skill, of cleverness, of cunning, of smarts. So C is also probably a pretty good option. E, he asks Mary to help him out of the well. Does that show skill? Just asking someone for help? Anybody can ask for help. I don't think that really sets him apart as having dexterity or skill, which is what we think dexterity means. We're kind of going with our best guess at this point. But D, nah, that's not a very good option. What about E? He persuades Bridget to let him hide on the farm. Now, I could see why you might think this would be a good option because he's using persuasion. And I guess you could say persuasion is a kind of skill. But we only have two choices here, so we have to pick the two best options. And in reviewing A through E, you should be coming to the conclusion that the ones that show his physical skill best, because that's kind of the idea of dexterity is physical skill, those are our best options. So based on that, what do you guys think? What do you think are the two best options? you should be coming to the conclusion that they are B and C. And keep in mind, to get this question correct, you'd have to pick two correct answers, not just one. So this is where you need to really read the question carefully to give yourself a good chance at getting all of the points. So again, the question says, pick two actions that show his dexterity. And you should be, to get this question right, you should be selecting B and C because they show his physical skill.